Good afternoon, everyone. How are you?
Good.
Well, thanks for joining us. Quick introduction. I'm Steve Howley. I have worked in the district for almost 10 years now. I'm currently in the school psychologist at the high school.
And I'm Jen Wolf, the adolescent counselor at the high school, and been here for about 6 years. Prior to that, did some outpatient mental health, worked in inpatient psychiatric hospital, worked with people in hospice, kind of anticipating the death of a parent or loved one. Kind of done a little bit of lots of different kids who witnessed domestic violence, to different things prior to the school.
And as a disclaimer, Jen and I have done many, well, not many, but several talks together. We both have no problem speaking in front of people. We both despise using microphones. So if you can't hear us, just don't just raise, give a thumbs up. We can project our voices needed. So thank you for signing up. Oh no, a technology failure.
Already.
All right.
You ran through it too.
I did, yeah. There we go. All right, so we're here to talk about anxiety and stress, but as it relates to substance abuse. And the reason, purpose, and meaning behind that is a couple pieces. One, that childhood and adolescence is just filled with stress. Like, there's nothing you can do about it. Every kid's going to have a panic attack type moment where they're screaming at you, or they have no friends, or something's gone wrong. So it covers everything. But the connection to substance abuse is that, unfortunately, there's a press to, and a growing press that we're finding amongst our students through our surveys, that there's this connection between, oh, I'm stressed, I can do X, Y, or Z bad behavior to get rid of that. I can avoid a situation. I can smoke weed. I can drink to socialize. And there's this growing feeling that we can use substances to manage our stress. When the reality is, as you heard from Anne Marie, that doesn't hit any of the protective factors. That actually just makes things worse. The protective factors of building skills, of resiliency, of connecting with our parents, connecting with our community, those don't come out of using substances. But too many of our young adults and young children are having that mixed message coming that way. So that's sort of why we're bringing together. Our focus is going to be on stress and anxiety, and really kind of managing that as a part of that protective factor system. If at any point we say something that doesn't jive, doesn't make sense, please feel free to interrupt with questions. The method for today is we're going to give overall information, and then we're going to bring it to a Q&A at the end, and if we have time, we have a few scenarios that you guys can kind of role play together and sort of get advice from each other as families, educators, or ask us for feedback. So, make sense? Sound good? Cool.
Yeah.
Do we have a full copy?
We can email it too. I think
Yeah.
Anne Marie will email it out to everybody who signed up.
Yeah, she's putting together something that everybody will get full copies, and then at the end when you leave, we have brochures that sort of highlight the highlight points for takeaways, and then we have resource lists that'll have everything from online videos listed to books to even apps that you can use with your kids.
So there's so much discussion in our nation, in our world, in pop culture about how anxiety is on the rise, anxiety and depression on the rise, right? And as human beings, it's part of our nature to try and figure out, well, why is that? You know, is it because of cell phones and because we can't turn things off? And, well, yeah, it may be because of cell phones. But the reality is cell phones aren't going away. Much to my chagrin, I wish we could just toss them out the door, right? And we could all just pretend that that didn't exist. It's not happening. The bottom line is we got to figure out a way to develop the skills in these kids so they can manage, whether it is a cell phone or whether it's, you know, they're trying drugs earlier and then don't develop the skills. We've got to figure out ways to teach them the skills. And I feel like in schools, we're finally coming around to that, right? Like we've been really clear in teaching, reading, math, all those kinds of things. Now, I think there's a real push to kind of teaching some of these social emotional skills to give kids the tools they need to be able to manage it. It's funny because my father-in-law, I remember him saying when the Hanover Mall opened on Sundays, he thought like that was the end of the world. Here we go. But when I look back at it, I think, well, that is potentially a factor, right? Because all of a sudden, it's not just hockey that plays on Sundays, but now soccer plays on Sundays, and lacrosse plays on, you know, there is no more family time carved out, dedicated family time. You can create that within your own family. But I laughed at him at the time, but as I think about it now, I think there may be some of these causal factors. The reality is, we can do some things to mitigate some of that risk. We can hold off allowing our kids to have a cell phone. We can carve out the family time, whether it's spiritual in nature or just having dinner together, or whatever that might be. So that's why I guess it's all over the news, and I get that Steve jokes because I love that slide, but I think it's because it does summarize kind of the reality of the world that we're living in. And I think stress in general is a very normative thing, right? Like we all experience stress. It's what gets some of us up off the couch to get things done. And when you think back to the age of the caveman, if we were being chased by a tiger, we would have that instinct to kind of fight, flee, whatever you needed to do to take care of yourself, right? Well, clearly we're not running from tigers anymore. However, sometimes that physiological experience that we had when we were fleeing from tigers still occurs for some of us. And whether it's a paper tiger, like, whether it's something that you are worried about in theory, we're not really running from tigers anymore, but certainly the level of stress that kids and adults experience right now can be greater. And the physiological response is the same. So if you are feeling like you're fleeing from a tiger, if your heart is racing, you're short of breath, all that kind of stuff, granted, your body can only maintain that for a certain period of time, several minutes, if we're talking about a true panic attack type thing. But the reality is some kids run with that level, and some adults run with that level of cortisol going haywire in their brain, those kinds of things. And if you're living your life like you're running from this tiger all the time, that's exhausting. And so trying to teach them, again, the skills, if they start to feel this physiological response, what skills can we teach them to recognize it and then to try to interrupt that? And that's what we're going to spend our time talking about, kind of that anxiety is this kind of faulty alarm system. How do we kind of bring that back into whack?
All right, so before we get there, we want to kind of bring you guys into the brain of children and adolescents, right? So as a child goes from young childhood up to adolescence, and any of you that have teenagers have recognized this, they just wonderfully get more emotional as they go. And they don't naturally get the ability to manage that yet. They just seem to get more and more emotional. And that's normal and healthy. That's okay. Not fun to deal with some days, but it's okay. But unfortunately, there's a direct connection between their brain's strength and ability to manage information and their anxiety or stress level. So as they get more anxious, their ability to process information in that moment actually decreases. Like some research will say it can drop, like, in that moment of real intense anxiety, you're like 20% less likely to process information meaningfully. So working memory is a great example. Basically, as your working memory skills go down, your ability to listen to others goes down. Because that's the ability to take information, know what's important, and absorb it and pay attention to it. Well, if you're stressed, that goes down. So if you're stressed and mom and dad are talking at you, your chance of understanding that is probably lower. And so then you're probably getting more frustrated. So then you're probably yelling at them. And then and it just has this cycle. And it's important to recognize that that's not just the kid being emotional. It's really their processing of information is impacted in those moments. So the sooner we can support them, the better we can help them quicker, the better chance they are to learn that skill in the moment. We also have to remember that if they hit a moment of high anxiety, high stress, don't teach them. Support them, nurture them, wait till they're calmed down. But then it might be uncomfortable. Maybe you said something you didn't like, but you got to go back to them when they're calm and use that to reinforce it. I'm a basketball geek, so I always think of it as not good at all. But if I was good, right, and I didn't feel good on a game, if I knew I had practice, and I had my jump shot dialed in, and my handle was on point, and I was respected by my teammates, and my coaches supported me, I'd be more likely to go out there and push through not feeling well. Because I knew I had those skills automatic, right? So same thing for a kid. If we can teach them when they're feeling confident, when they're relaxed, it makes those skills more automatic. So then when they're feeling impacted, they're emotionally distraught, they're not relying on have to think step by step and listen to people and go, okay, my coping skills are, our mom and dad said. It becomes more automatic and it's requiring less of their brain power. So we really want to meet them and keep going back and forth, but always remind ourselves that when they're freaking out at us, it's just emotions. They're probably not at that same level of, where's my smart kid that I can talk to at dinner? Why are they screaming at me, and why are they not hearing the same story I've told them before that they usually respond to? Because it really does impact their moment of development.
And can I jump in on that for a minute? Because the flip side of that is, you could, in this moment of calm, right, have talked to your kid, okay, when your brother goes to whack you in the head, what are all the things that you could do differently, right? Instead of like calling out and hitting them. And they can list, I could come and tell you, I could go and, you know, whip the pillow against the wall. They could give you all these great things. In the heat of the moment, that's, you know, their working memory, again, is gone. And there's no, in fact, if you do it in the heat of the moment, they'll go like, well, I'm glad I did it, you know, as opposed to, you know, all these other things that you have taught them. You've taken all this time to teach them, but it goes right out the window in that moment.
So let's talk a little bit about, before we get into what to do about all this, let's just give a framework of where this, like where our motivation to share this information from you guys comes from. So more and more research is being done in the field of mental health and emotional health and behavioral health. There's grants, there's supports, etc. Am I? You guys,
It's
you
okay.
guys good? Okay. I read the room there. It's pretty proud. I got it. Good. All right. So just as an understanding for, and when we say disorder, it means there's a diagnostic manual that's put out by the American Psychiatric Foundation, right? And so they put it out and they revise it, and it's what the medical fields go by. And so a disorder is someone that meets that criteria. So a student with anxiety disorder meets symptom checklist 1, 2, and 3, just like a medical doctor would be, and then impacts their functioning. So I could be a high energy person, but if I make it through my day, I get my work done, I socialize, I'm healthy, I eat, I sleep, I don't have a disorder. If I'm bouncing off the room and I'm high energy and I'm never listening to anyone and I don't accomplish anything, probably going to get that ADHD with hyperactivity disorder. You know what I mean? So it's about that impact on functioning. And as things have gone on, we've started to notice onset of anxiety disorder being the youngest. Like I said, childhood and adolescence is just riddled with anxiety. Average onset of 6. Behavior disorders are anything with an externalizing component, so acting out, ADHD, oppositional stuff, aggression, frustration, 11 years old. Mood disorder is the inability to regulate your mood. So like, hey, things are cool and nothing's happened, now everything sucks. And nobody helped me out, but now everything's cool again. And really that ongoing cycle, not just that 1 or 2 hormonal days, but a continuous cycle like that. We're seeing those, that used to be like 16 to 18, we're starting to recognize that as early as 13 now. You can see the trend, they get more and more serious as we go up. Substance abuse disorder, 15, and psychotic disorder, 22. Now where our research and understanding is also going, anxiety is easy to manage. You get a stressed kiddo, even if it's ongoing irrational. Their stress doesn't, they have 100 friends, they come over every day, I have no friends, it sucks. That's easier to manage than a kid that you can't even predict their damn mood. You can say, Steve's coming home from basketball today, he's going to be pissed off. You can predict that. Once we get to a point where we can't predict, or then add in substances and we don't even know what they're doing to their brain, we really can't predict, it gets much harder to manage. So the earlier we can support our children, the more protective factors we can put in place, the less chance we have to deal with as parents, as teachers, as a community, with these much more difficult disorders. And also, the outcome, the prognosis for an individual with anxiety or behavior disorder or depression is much better than a young adult with a mood disorder. Because we think back to some of your friends growing up, that person that could just tee off on you at a moment's notice and then be best friend the next day without apologizing, they probably burnt a lot of bridges. And they probably continue to do that if they're not managing themselves as adults at jobs and socially. And then you go on to the substance abuse and psychotic disorders. So the prognosis becomes much more challenging as we don't manage these. So I don't know how much people see information around town. We just want to give a quick snapshot of, there's a lot of information about this throughout the state of Massachusetts and specifically in Scituate that we, as a Facts Coalition, as a school, gather. So we just want to give a snapshot of the most, some of this information comes out annually. Like we're always collecting data. So, in reports for anxiety, 63% of males and 80% of females in grades 4 through 12 report that they worry a lot. So worrying a lot, that continuous feel of worry, is like the first diagnostic checkbox of a potential anxiety disorder. That's ongoing worry. 42% of students in grades 4 through 12 report having many fears and being easily scared. So again, that when it becomes a more global stress, it becomes more of a concern. If you can say, I'm afraid of tests, but that's it, or I'm afraid of speaking in public, but that's it, probably not going to impact your functioning. If you have many, more chance of you feeling impacted. 10% of students in grades 4 through 12, now remember, we're going all the way down to grades 4 here, report that they would almost always rather be alone than with people of my age. That's like red flag. That's like we are now impacting functioning because a child, as a human, is a social, animal, for lack of a better word. And upwards of 10% of students saying, I would rather be alone. So now we've gone from, okay, concern to red flag to we've now hit some diagnostic criteria.
So definition of anxiety. Obviously, we all experience anxiety at various points in our lives, and we're going to talk a little bit about, elaborate a little more on what Steve said in terms of when it impacts functioning. But it's a normal reaction to a temporary stress, right? So it's this exaggerated sense of danger. When we're talking about heading to the side of anxiety where it is impacting function, it's exaggerated, it's misperceptions, and it's behaving in response to those misperceptions and that exaggerated fear. And you're trying to find ways to cope with that. And a big one is avoidance. We're going to talk a lot about avoidance. So by definition, it's an excessive irrational fear or dread of everyday situations to the point of impacting functioning. The symptoms are the frequent worry, so it impacts both your thought, your behavior, your feelings, and so you're thinking, you're always worried, it might be keeping you up at night, you have the racing heart, the sweaty palms, nervousness, a lot of somatic complaints, a lot of my stomach hurts, we see that a lot in school, kids coming in and saying, I can't, I don't feel well, and you'll see the same kids coming over and over and over again, and they may not recognize that as anxiety, and it may not be anxiety. Obviously you want to rule out medical first, always, but if we're seeing patterns like that, we would want to kind of take a closer look and talk to kids. So if we're looking at, again, that kind of stress to anxiety and then anxiety continuum, you've got kids who are kind of minimally impacted and then kids who are majorly impacted. And that is depending upon the duration of the symptoms, right? Like if you have somebody who is anxious for an upcoming test or something like that, and it's a very finite period of time, and then they kind of go on their way. They can do things like study, and that helps them. They can do things like get a good night's sleep, and maybe they have butterflies or whatever, but they can kind of plow through that, right? That's kind of the normal level of stress or anxiety that any of us would experience. And a kid who doesn't struggle with anxiety would say to themselves, oh, I just have to budget my time. I got to remember I have hockey, and then I have dinner, and I'm going to study for an hour or two, and then I have to babysit and such and such. So a normal kid, that's kind of how they'd approach it, right? A kid with anxiety, that can be their undoing. It can be they are up all night, they are not eating, not sleeping, then they do have the stomach ache and they're going to school. So again, if this is a one-shot deal and you're worried about one test and it's kind of minimal reaction, we're not talking kind of clinical diagnostic anxiety. But there's a whole bunch in between there. So number and intensity of symptoms you could have, again, if you feel like your heart's beating fast. If you have a whole slew of symptoms repeatedly and it's impacting your functioning, the impact on functioning is the biggest one, I would say. If it's preventing you from going to school, if it's preventing you from going to the dance, if it's preventing you from doing things that we would hope and like to see kids doing at whatever various age group and appropriate to development, that's when we start to worry and we're really trying to teach the skills more intensely. Okay, so similar to the substance abuse situation in terms of risk factors, we think about mental health in this biopsychosocial model. So there's the biological, your chemical, how you're wired. Are you missing certain hormones that make it hard for you, that you're kind of predisposed to depression or predisposed to anxiety? Then there's the, you could have, if you're at higher risk if you have a direct parent who has a diagnosed anxiety disorder. There's the biological piece of that, and then there's also the environmental piece, right? So if you're parented by somebody who has high anxiety, that can also be tricky, because if you're kid is winding up, and you're winding up thinking, oh crap, here it comes, I don't know what to do, and blah, 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 blah. So you got not only the genetic, but also your own kind of temperament, which impacts them. The other psychological things, which are the big things with anxiety, the negative thinking stuff that goes on, we're going to talk a fair amount about that. That perception is really distorted for these kiddos, and helping them to kind of recognize like that whole black or white thinking thing, like nobody likes me, or I fail every test, kind of challenging some of those thoughts. So that's the psychological impact. And then social, the environmental factors. Obviously, we live in a community where there's pretty high demands, right? There's lots of stress. There's lots of, I can't even tell you how many seniors I have in my office these days crying about this whole college process and about, I don't even want to tell anybody that I'm applying to that school because it's not considered, a top school or whatever, or I'm taking 5 APs, or I'm not taking 5 APs, and I feel it's a loaded thing. So that's the kind of more the environmental situation. So all these, 3 things come together, and if you've got multiple kind of risk factors in each of those, obviously the risk is greater that that's going to be impacted.
So we just want to give a quick overview. If anybody is working or parenting children that have an anxiety disorder, or you are talking to your doctor about an anxiety disorder, wanted to give you a sense of some of the potential diagnoses that are very common within the child and adolescent realm. And the overall theme of these is a child who's just afraid of the world. They see the world as this big, scary thing, and then for children and adolescents, and they want to control it. And that's where a lot of the back and forth is. The psychiatric world is a great way of, when they don't know what it is, they just have these open-ended diagnoses, which is what generalized anxiety is. They really don't know what the specific root of it is, but we have this student, this child, this adolescent that's just always on edge. And they're more likely to have panic attacks that you can't really tie down, more of a little sort of wave of anxiety. Separation anxiety is exactly what it seems like. This can be early onset. We have many families in town that have been dealing with this. They've been dragging their kid kicking and screaming at every event that they can think of. But once the child is away and has dealt with that separation, they can manage. But that separation is challenging. We also see onsets of this if a caregiver passes away. That can be a very common outcome.
Can I also jump in too? Because each one of these, like you think about separation anxiety for an 18-month-old is normal, right? Like we would expect to see that as they're kind of discovering, oh, look at my parent is, drop me off at the babysitter, and I'm not sure that they're going to come back. So I think each one of these you see a little bit of the developmental piece of that, but when does it interfere with functioning? When does it become problematic?
What's the frequency and intensity of it?
Social
anxiety is the fear of social situations, exactly what it is, but again, impacting functioning. Very common diagnosis in adolescents.
By definition, I feel like adolescence is social
anxiety.
Okay. Right? Like, I'm so afraid somebody's judging me, looking at me,
I think my hair's supposed to be green this week, but I don't like green hair, but what about the ripped jeans? Those are too ripped. And it just goes back and forth. Panic disorder, not as common, more of a physiological response, and usually something where you don't see it coming, where that physical response is the first symptom an individual observes, and they have those panic attacks that then lead to a decrease in function, but much more of that sort of physical heart palpitations, trouble breathing, the sweating that kind of can come on as a quick onset.
And I think kids throw that around like it's, a lifesaver. Like, I just had a panic attack, and,
Meanwhile, this is I can't go to class when I have a panic attack. It's not good.
Yeah. But if, like Steve said, if you're truly experiencing a panic attack, you can feel like a heart attack, If you've ever seen anybody, we're going to watch a video of that in a little bit, but, so it speaks to both the misuse of the language, whether it's kids calling themselves crazy, or,
And someone that had a first panic attack can be very traumatized. I don't want to overuse the word traumatized, but a teacher might call a nursing and they're having a seizure. They're on the floor. I mean, it can be a real, that feeling if your heart can't stop, you can't catch your breath and it comes out of nowhere is very concerning, obviously, for the person experiencing it. And they can, then what will happen is if they start to get a little sweaty because the air in the high school is really poor and doesn't work that day, then they're going, oh my God, I'm going to have a panic attack. And then they can have these responses to it that aren't even, so really helping them through that is very challenging.
And once you've had a panic attack,
hypersensitization.
You're afraid you're gonna have another one, and that, breeds more panic and anxiety, so that's kind of part of the cycle.
And obsessive compulsive disorder we put here because it's a growing diagnosis, and a lot of people don't recognize that it is an anxiety disorder. It's that, think of it almost as a need to control. And so when you feel out of control, your anxiety kicks up, and so the treatment that's proven to work for us is a lot of the same work that goes into anxiety. So we just want to make sure we include that in there.
So this is a clip of Dan Harris, who's an anchor on ABC News, and he apparently had a panic attack on air. Wow. So this is a really short clip, and it kind of...
And next tonight, something different. Imagine millions of people watch your life come unglued, an all-out panic attack on TV. It happened to our Dan Harris, but his journey of discovery brought back some lessons for all of us about our lives too, and he's telling us about it tonight, Dan.
Hi, Dan. This is a very personal story, as you know, because you were right there when it all started. Sometimes there are things holding us back from being happy, and we're not aware of it until life hits us over the head with a frying pan. And that is what happened to me.
From ABC News, this is Good Morning America.
Welcome to the most embarrassing day of my life.
We're going to go now to Dan Harris, who's at the news desk.
Good morning, Charlie and Diane. Thank you. This is me 10 years ago, and the reason this is the most embarrassing day of my life is not that it looks like I've been attacked by a blow dryer and a can of hairspray. No, it's that I am about to freak out on national television. Health News now, one of the world's most commonly prescribed medications, may be providing a big bonus. Researchers report people who take cholesterol-lowering drugs called statins for at least 5 years may also lower their risk for cancer. But it's too early to prescribe statins slowly for cancer production. At this point, I realize I'm helpless, so I bail right in the middle. That does it for news. We're going to go back now to Robin and Charlie.
And just to pause there for 1 second, find me a child or adolescent that recognizes that they're crashing and it handles it with that integrity. Write a book about it, because your child's not going to be able to recognize that they're losing their breath and can't talk anymore and be able to do something about it as well as he did. So just to point out that one discrepancy between the adult and the child.
All right, thanks very much, Dan Harris at the news desk with some of the headlines of the morning. Want to go to Tony Perkins now.
Once the fear subsided, humiliation rushed in. I knew with rock-solid certainty that I had just had a panic attack on national television. So why would I tell you this very embarrassing story? Because that on-air meltdown was the culmination of something that had been building for years, something I never stopped to address. It's something we all battle, whether we have panic attacks or not. Call it the voice in your head.
That's where I feel stress.
It's the inner narrator that can control us.
Highly critical.
Get in the way of living the life we want to lead. For Brian Simmons, it was outbursts of anger.
I would act very reactively.
For Becky Schmitz, it was emotional eating.
Eating was like my security blanket.
And for a young Dr. Mehmet Oz, it was a racing mind that kept him from focusing on one thing at a time.
For me, saying a voice in the head is too benign an expression of what really happens. That massive cacophony that we hear, deafeningly loud.
Does it surprise you at all how much time we all spend fixating on these self-defeating voices we hear?
I've always been surprised how much time we spend wasting on the voices in our head telling us we're not good enough.
In my case, like many Americans, my inner voice was pushing me to succeed. Annual New Year's party in New York. This is me in my late 20s.
Thank you, Dan.
I had my dream job, but I also had doubts about whether I was good enough. It's hard to do that. All right, I'm going to try it. 3, 2, 1. My solution? Become a workaholic. After 9/11, I volunteered to spend years in war zones, where I covered the heroics of our men and women overseas and got a real taste of both the horror and the adrenaline of combat. After years of always barreling forward, when I finally slowed down, it was as if my mind revolted and I got depressed. And so, in my free time, I briefly but stupidly began self-medicating. And it was those recreational drugs, my doctor would later tell me, that almost certainly produced the on-air panic attack. But losing it in front of 5 million people became a turning point. It set me off on a strange, unplanned odyssey, the kind of search so many of us embark upon, for answers, understanding, and strength. Ultimately, it would lead me to something I never would have expected, as it has for Dr. Oz and millions of others.
Going inside my mind is no longer going behind enemy lines.
After a journey that involved megachurches, self-help gurus, and brain researchers, what I found is something simple, scientifically tested, and completely free. It's being done by executives, pro athletes, and even the U.S. Marines. It's not a miracle cure, but I like to say it makes you about 10% happier. Much more on that tomorrow night, right here.
Right here, and again, Dan, for all of us who've been through this with you, wow, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And learn about the simple answers Dan found tomorrow on World News in his new book, 10% Happier.
So, like Steve said, I mean, you can visually see that. I'm sure it felt 100 times worse to him than it appeared to us in watching that, but you could see him short of breath. You could see his mind, you know, he couldn't bring it back. He couldn't get back on track and figure out what he was supposed to say, even though he probably had it on a prompter right in front of him, right? That it just completely derailed him. And this is an adult who, you know, has obviously lived with this for a period of time. We're trying to teach our kids how not to let that happen, or how to deal with it kind of before it gets to that point. And I think the connection to the whole substance abuse thing is huge, because if you've got kids, like he alluded to it too, if you've got kids who are feeling, again, that whole social anxiety, feeling like they don't fit in, they're not comfortable, and they're turning to substances to try to manage that stuff, to kind of mask that, it not only creates you know, the risk for substance abuse and addiction, it may bring them some kind of temporary relief, but it does not. I mean, research tells us and our work tells us that it does not help in the long run. So if you're smoking weed, which is what the kids are doing right now, they're smoking weed, they say, because it helps with their anxiety, and it may help in that very short run. It may alleviate a little bit of anxiety for them, but the reality is the long-term use of it, it doesn't work. It doesn't sustain that, even though they might feel like it helps in that moment. It does not sustain that feeling of kind of well-being. And then you get the lack of motivation and all the other stuff that comes along with it. So in terms of anxiety trip-ups for kids, I think about if I were to show up here and I was wearing a white blouse and I had spilled coffee, I would be awfully aware of the fact that I had this big old stain, right? Well, these kids are walking around sometimes feeling that way and overreacting to things. Now, you may not have even noticed the coffee stain on my shirt, but I may be behaving in a way that's kind of like trying to hide it or whatever, or overreacting in a way that nobody cares whether you spilled coffee on your shirt, right? So that's, some of what these kids are experiencing, whether it's panic. Sometimes you see, I actually was just talking with somebody recently about this, how angry their child is. And behind that anger is all this anxiety and uncertainty and inability to manage those intense feelings. And it comes out as rage, or in the younger kids you'll see it come out as kind of oppositional stuff. The other thing that we see here, certainly in this community and many other communities too, is the whole perfectionism thing, and how there are kids who can't hand in the paper, not because it's not spectacular. I can't tell you how many teachers are like, nope, that's good, you can hand that in. But for these kids who ruminate on things and they can't, it's not enough, it's not good enough. Maybe, a B+ to them is the equivalent of an F. Or they just can't stop the editing. They've just got to keep editing and editing and editing. Those are really trip-ups for some of the kids. And behind all this is kind of what he spoke about, were all these thought distortions, right? All or nothing, black or white thinking. Everything's good or everything's bad. And trying to teach kids the kind of gray area is important. How do we teach kids that you haven't failed every test? Not everybody, oftentimes if we're working with a kid who doesn't want to go into class because they're feeling super anxious, they're like, I can't go in there because everybody's looking at me. And that may have been reinforced when they one time went in late and the kid happened to look up, which wasn't even paying attention to you, but in that kid's mind, it kind of confirmed and reinforced the fact that everybody's looking at me. Well, in reality, we can challenge and help that kid challenge those thoughts. How likely is it that that kid really noticed what you were doing? Do you think they might have been looking up to look at the clock that was above your head? Again, challenging some of those thought distortions, catastrophizing, you know, it's the end of the world. Disqualifying the positives, you have kids who will, you know, even if you're the parent saying, oh, but look at this, Johnny, you did X, Y, and Z, look at all these people, blah, blah, blah. In their mind, they are just kind of disqualifying that. It doesn't matter what you say, they don't believe it. That kind of negative loop that's going on in their head takes over. And the biggest thing I think with anxiety is that the kids and adults do whatever they can to try to avoid, right? Because they're trying to lessen the physiological feelings that they're having, and then those thoughts that are racing in their head. They're trying to do anything they can. So anxiety is like, get me the heck out of here, you know, chirping in their head. So, and that again may bring temporary relief. Like, okay, I just got out of that class and I'm all right. But then it doesn't teach the kid, okay, you can tolerate this. You can sit in there, and there are things that you can do that will make it better, and that you can get through that, and you will be okay. Kind of challenging the distorted thoughts that kids have.
So what do we do about it, right? Because that's kind of the key. So we're going to start with what do we tend to do about it, but we shouldn't, right? And the problem with things that don't work is they do work, but they only work in the short term, okay? So I have a built-in excuse for avoidance. I have a 14-month old, right? So if I didn't like speaking in public, I could agree to do it because it would make me look good professionally. I could call Jen, I could say, guess what? Evelyn's sick. I can't be there today. She's not going to question it. And I could be sitting home, playing my fantasy football, not feeling stressed. Until the next time I had to speak in front of someone. Then what's my excuse to get out of it? Because I don't want to look not unprofessional. I don't want to give up on my job, but I don't want to do it either. So it helped me today, but it wouldn't help me next time, or the time after, or the time after. So they work, but only in the moment. They don't do anything to actually treat the anxiety, treat the stress. And one of the biggest challenges we're facing as we work with young adults, as we work with children, as we parent our kids, is that substances are becoming more and more connected. And part of that is just more information. Part of that is the stuff that hasn't worked in the past, the original, like when we were all in high school, those DARE programs that tried to scare us, those didn't work. Because if you tell me not to smoke weed, and I go out with my friends and I have a damn good time and smoke weed, you're just an old person that doesn't know what you're talking about. Or, if I have a few beers and I'm relaxed and I'm socializing and I'm not shaking in my boots, it helped my anxiety. Screw you guys. You don't know what you're talking about. So, and I think we need to accept that. And so Jen was talking about avoidance not working. It does though. Like I just said, it does for that day. Right? I have a stomach ache, I'm not going to school. I sprained my ankle, I'm not going to soccer practice. It worked until Tuesday rolls around, or Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday. And then it builds and it builds and it builds. So we have to recognize that and we have to accept that. And it's okay to say to our children, I understand you want to avoid, because it's going to feel better today. What are you going to do tomorrow? Let me help you prepare for today. And we have to go back to that skill-building mentality. And that's the same mentality that we need to start taking with substances too. We have to be open and honest with them. We have to talk about them. We have to teach them about the impact of, the effects. We have to talk about the social norms. We have to talk about, grand thinking. Every kid in Scituate drinks. No, they don't. We have the data to prove it. Every kid in my grade smokes. No, they don't. Yeah, they have a vape. You just don't know about it. No, we do, because we have the data to show that it's still not the norm to drink or smoke. But if you wanted to think it, it is. The other problem with substances, if you're socially scared, you can take any kid and put them in any situation. They got a bag of weed, they're making friends. Right? So again, you told me this isn't going to work, but it did. It did work for that moment. The other things that don't work is not validating the emotions. So, I don't want to go to school. I have a good relationship with my parents. I say, I'm afraid of the test. The things that we tend to say or want to say that don't work are, we'll just toughen up. Or don't think about it. Or you're prepared, it doesn't matter. Don't worry about what Johnny's going to say about your hairdo. Don't worry about, but it doesn't matter because I'm going to worry.
Because your internal body is like running from that paper tiger, right? So like, just don't worry about it. It doesn't help those internal things that are going on inside of you settle down. It's like, don't be allergic to peanuts, you know what I mean? Like, it just doesn't work that way. You're having this reaction, you're having an emotional reaction that you don't quite know what to do with. So just saying, don't do it doesn't help.
So for, and I don't know if you want to use a script, but as we're talking, right, as we're talking, I want you to not think of a teddy bear. Just don't think of a teddy bear, okay? Just whatever you do, right? Ignore me. Well, check your phones. I don't care. Do not think about a teddy bear. And tell yourself you're not allowed to think about a teddy bear. So one of the things that doesn't work is invalidating that feeling. And how many are still thinking about the teddy bear? How many can't stop thinking about the teddy bear? And who's threatened by a teddy bear, right? Now, what if it's something threatening? You know, we've all been there when family members have been sick. Try to go to work and we're worried about our parent. We're worried about our sibling. And that's real. Then to have someone say, don't worry about your sick brother today, you need to get to work. It's just, it doesn't happen that way. We need to validate and accept the feelings. Another thing that doesn't work that we tend to do is incentives. Say, I know you're worried about going to your soccer game because you don't feel prepared, but if you go, we're going dribbles. That's great. Because it doesn't work, it doesn't teach it. I mean, it might for that moment, if it's just a stressful situation, and it's rational, like I don't feel prepared, but fine, I'll push through. Great, they've got that resiliency to push through, and that little piece of ice cream is going to get them over the hump. But, Jen, you speak Latin?
No.
Oh, well, on Tuesday on our after-school meeting, you're going to speak Latin, I'll give you $1,000. I'm not going to teach you, but I'll give you $1,000, right? Yeah, you want $1,000, right? But you're not, I don't think it'll work. So those incentives, those rewards, don't work, again, going back, you'll see the theme here, unless the kid has the skill to manage the situation. So going back to, you know, incentives don't work, validate, threatening doesn't work. It just doesn't. Especially going back to where their brain's at and they're like, now they're up there and they're just like basically walking emotion. Good luck threatening an irrational, emotional teenager. You know, just good luck. You can try. They're probably going to scream and yell it back at you and create a bigger fight, or they're going to go outside and say they're going to do what you want them to do with no intention of doing it. Because they're just reacting emotionally. So just increasing that level of emotion and taking, not only are you stressed, but now you're stressed about disappointing me or ruining the family, or some of these fights can just get really intense.
And I think leaves us feeling like inadequate parents, right? I mean, yeah.
I have a question about allowing avoidance. Sometimes as parents, we're not ready right now to have a 2-hour conversation about what we should do and all the positive things we can do, et cetera, et cetera. Is there a gray area about allowing avoidance?
No.
Isn't parenting a big gray area? If I had a book on exactly what to do, I'd be a millionaire. Yeah, I mean the short answer is yeah.
And I think you do the work not in that moment, right? Like, you know your kid and you're trying to help them anticipate what those moments are. Sometimes we can't. Like, you find yourself, you're in it and you're doing the best you can in that moment. But that doesn't mean that you don't go back after the fact and talk about it. Like, okay, this is how that went down. And even if you are like, okay, you're grounded, you know, and you know, really this is anxiety talking, this isn't just my kid being defiant or whatever. Because you would approach that differently, right? You might consequence this one, and you might try to help them find other ways and other strategies with the other side. It's very difficult to do in the moment. So you can always go back and undo or have a conversation about it and try to teach them the skills. Because the avoidance thing, they're going to do everything they can, everything within their power, whether it's kicking, screaming, they might run out the door, you know, and the older the kid gets, what are you going to do? You're going to put a teenager, you know, you're going to shove them in the car and get them there. So it's hard as a parent, and when you've tried all these things, you know, because we've all been in those moments where you've tried all these things, and you feel like an absolute, you know, parent who has no authority, no, you know, ability to help them. It's just really a helpless feeling when you find yourself having tried all these and they don't work.
And on the other side, you've got to allow the gray area too, right? So never would you have expected your kid that has always been social to freak out and want to skip the birthday party. That was so unexpected. And you start to realize they're not connected to that social group. Next time, so, okay, caught up that, oh my God, they avoid. It's not like I was a bad parent, I let them skip the birthday party, I should have forced it and just ripped the Band-Aid off. You recognize, you go back to it, and then the next time, maybe it's just not as intense. Maybe they go to part of the birthday party. Or maybe it's, you know, you were starting at the soccer field and go back to the house, they don't want to go back to the house. You know, and so it's not all or nothing on either end, the good or the bad. It's really, the goal is that every time that you address a situation, you go back be open with your children, teach a skill, and the next time, hopefully it's less intense. It doesn't have to be perfect every time, I mean, it doesn't work, but that you've had that awareness, had that moment with your child, taught a skill, but they're going to practice it. The first time you swing a golf club, you're probably going to slice it. The next time, hopefully you slice it a little less, and that's the goal. Eventually it's going to go straight, and the kid will be off running down the fairway, but you're just trying to, change the trajectory a little bit each time you work with your children.
Because you're trying to teach them that it's not as dangerous as they fear it is, right? So you are trying to teach them the skills to get them there so that then you can say, now look at that, tell me, was that, how did that feel to be there? And usually, oftentimes when we have kids in our office, like, yeah, that wasn't nearly as bad as I thought that was going to be.
But also, if they're having all or nothing, black or white thinking, we can't have that. We have to be the rational side for them as we're reflecting. Again, not in that moment, but as we're reflecting and trying to teach those skills, we have to recognize they're saying it's all or nothing. We better be gray then. Because if we're all or nothing, we're just going to it's just going to butt heads and they're not going to be open to that moment of teaching. All right, so what does work, right? And this one's at top with a big exclamation mark because it just sounds so easy, but it's just not. But the overall goal that we want to do is to teach these self-regulations. Teach someone that doesn't have those adolescents do not have self-regulation skills. They just don't. You find a kid that likes video games and you put them in front of a video game, it's amazing how long they can go. You find a kid that likes hockey and you put them on the rink, it's amazing how long they can skate in that circle with a puck. So they don't naturally have those self-regulation skills, so we need to teach them, for good and bad. We're not always honing in on what didn't go well. We're honing on what does go well too, but we need to regulate. We need to learn ourselves. We need to learn who we are, what we need to do, and always go back to that. And I think one of the best ways to teach this skill is when things are going well. How did you manage that? So I'm really impressed. When I was your age, I didn't do that. How did you do that? And teach them to self-reflect so that then they can say, this is who I am, this is what doesn't work well, this is what does work well. But naturally, all of us go through our day. I'm sure many of you are very successful in your job. How many go through the ride home and say, today was a good day because I did X, Y, and Z? It's more automatic for adults. Kids don't. They're just in the moment flying through life. So teaching that back and forth is very powerful for them.
In a lot of cases, depending on the age of your kids, they don't even have the language, right, to articulate what that is. So it might be as simple as trying to give them the language at a very early age and then recognizing the physiological things that they start to feel. Maybe it's making the connection to stomach aches so that they can start to see, oh yeah, when my stomach hurts, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to throw up in the middle of the classroom, which is what I'm afraid of. It means, oh, there's that anxiety talking at me again, and what can I do to kind of manage that so that I don't have to get up and leave my class?
So this one, classic thing to think about. So stopping negative thoughts. Again, we're validating the negative thoughts, but we want to redirect them. Remember when you were 3, you thought there was a monster under your bed. Was there really a monster under your bed? Okay, well this is the monster under your bed. Let's work through it. How are we going to climb into your bed right now and find out that there's no monster? So you're walking through them. You're not saying, that's not happening. You're saying, you're feeling that, but let's find out if it's true, right? And so you're validating, but you're being the other side. You're being the rational thought. They're being irrational. They don't make sense. But we're not going to say you're dumb, you don't make sense. You're going to say, you're feeling that, but let's see if that monster's really under your bed. And that can go for a range. When your children are actually talking to you about what stresses them out, what scares them, what causes them anxiety, you're amazed at what they think. Like, stuff you could never picture. It's just, their world is different than ours was back then. You can't assume. You have to get them to that point where they're going to tell you what that monster under their bed is.
And the reality is, with a kid with anxiety, if you get up and look under the bed for the monster and the monster's not there, that's still not enough, right? Because that stuff is still kind of toiling inside their head. So challenging those, have you ever seen a monster under somebody's bed? Do you think anybody else has a monster under their bed? What would happen? You know what I mean? And again, you might not be able, that work is probably better off done not in that moment when that kid's trying to go to sleep. You're probably better off doing that outside of that. How realistic is it that, are there really monsters? Those kinds of things. Challenging some of that stuff outside of that so that when you're in that situation, you can come back to that.
And the beauty of it, and you think you'll have it under control until your kid says, well, one time on YouTube I saw it. Right? So they will always find that reason to validate their thoughts. And so you're going to continue to work with it. And that, I think, is one part of where the immense amount of information and non-stop information, when you are trying to support your children, that's when you'll see a lot of the impact of that.
And I think, so sometimes when I'm working with kids and we're going through those irrational thoughts, I'll say, okay, what are those thoughts? You know, I am gonna throw up in the middle of class. And then we write kind of 3 counter statements to that, some 3 strong, you know, statements, so that when they're in that moment, they can pull out that sheet of paper and be like, okay, that's all right, well, that's not gonna work this time. But they have, you know, several others to kind of go back to. So trying to, again, come up with ways that they can remember, because in the moment, they're not necessarily gonna remember.
Another one that sounds so easy, but is so challenging, is just routines and predictability. Now, the irony is, Jen and I have sat there and told you that your children are going to grow up to be more and more unpredictable. And yet, what they crave is routine and predictability. And the more that you can have routines in place, the more it's going to protect against anxiety. Because when those intrusive thoughts do come out of this isn't going to go well, you can say, well, for 365 days a year for the last 15 years of your life, it's gone well because we've done this. Now, obviously, nobody is that routine, but it gives you that power and it gives them that sense of predictability that when they're feeling irrational, they can go back to repetitive situations that they've experienced. So that goes to daily routines, weekly routines. There's a lot of research on families that just eat together. They don't do anything else. They have dinner together, and that's just what centers their routine. No matter what, it could be 8:30 at night, but they have dinner together. Is a huge protective factor for so many behavioral issues, including substance use. So even just small, maybe everybody's flying around. We've got kids in daycare, and we haven't had one in high school, and we're all doing different things. But at least we come together at some point, homework time together, dinner, or we all get up together. Maybe everyone's schedules, a parent works at home, dad goes into Boston, mom's down the street, whatever, but we have a morning routine. Anytime you can find those predictability and routines on a daily, and then pulling that out for a week, you know, and a month at a time, whatever works best for your family. But the more you can do that, not only does it lower the anxiety, but it gives all that added time to those protective factors of building a community within your family, building communication within your family, building communication amongst their siblings, or maybe their cousins if there's a Sunday dinner or something. It's a very powerful one.
The other thing about the routines and predictability is, you know, we try to anticipate what the routines might be, or if there's going to be a change in routine. I have a friend who had a kid with significant anxiety who's now in his early 20s, and she would have to qualify every statement, though. She'd be like, okay, now we're going to do this, and this, and this. But you never know, because God forbid there was any sort of like curveball thrown in there, and you didn't anticipate that. So she kind of had to give this disclaimer, and because he was not flexible in his thinking enough to be able to navigate that on his own. So she, like now, she feels like it's going to be on her tombstone, but you never know, because she had to say it all the time.
So these are a little more preventative, right? Like every kid is going to have negative, unrealistic thoughts. Teaching self-regulation, routines and predictability, those are a little more preventative. These are a little more reactionary. These are going to be after you've experienced it with your child. These are going to be some of the things you're going to want to go back to, right? And so you're going to want to help them anticipate and develop strategies for the things that we think are going to be anxiety-provoking. Again, we don't know, but if we know that, again, go back, doesn't like soccer practice because feels not up to snuff with the other kids on the field. If we know that, and we can prepare for it, and teach a strategy, maybe it's self-talk. When you're on the field, you say, you know, I'm just as good, or I'm faster, that, you know, you highlight the skill they're better, I'm the fastest one on the field, or I'm the one that's most aware, I get back in defense the best. It might not be true, but they think what they're thinking. And you teach that self-talk, then the next time someone comes up that catches them off guard, they can then use that again. It might not be the first time, but teaching that skill to endure is going to allow generalization across other anxiety-provoking things. And then as supports, one of the best things we can do is help them, you know, we know what's coming up, it's difficult for them, we can help them plan. They're not, kids and teenagers aren't good planners. They don't naturally think ahead, they don't put the big picture together, it's just where they're at developmentally. So we can be a support for them. We're not fighting with them, we're actually helping them plan. So then they can come to us and use us as their planner, and it's a back and forth two-way street that can be very powerful. All right. Then a few more sort of in-the-moment things that I think sometimes we lose track of. This is a big one for me, and one that I think kids and families lose track of a lot. Just healthy living. Our emotions come out of our brain. Our brain's a muscle. If we want to take care of our muscles, we exercise, we eat, we sleep. Anxiety makes those things more challenging because maybe we overeat, we undereat, we can't fall asleep, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But focusing on just healthy living is so preventative. But also recognizing that as we get more stressed, we probably lose track of that stuff. Going back to it is an intervention for anxiety. Staying involved, finding those preferred activities and staying engaged in them. Maybe anxiety has a lot of physiological responses. We can not feel well, stomach aches, headaches. Maybe then we don't go do something fun that day, so then we're just sitting there feeling anxious and we're not having fun. The next day is not going to be as good. So we really want to stay engaged and force that engagement. Ensure time for activities that are not contingent on behavior. If you have a kid really struggling with anxiety and they're starting to avoid their friends, they're going to piss you off. And you want to find time for that positive interaction that isn't contingent on anything. And this is for any sort of behavioral issues. Time for walk the dog with them, or let them go to their sleepover every Friday if they do. Or a lot of families come in, a big one is like the trip to grandma or grandpa's. Like that's always non-contingent because you're going to go see Grammy and Poppy no matter what. I don't care if you told me to F off and slam the door on my finger. You still get to go to that time. So there's those times that even if they're feeling out of control and they've done some things that have really just pissed you off, they still get that positive interaction, that positive self-feeling is very important.
And can I jump in on the body calming thing? Because again, this is the physiological response, right? So anything you can do to teach children breathing. I was struck by a student that was having a panic attack, and I was just doing simple breathe in through your nose, out through your mouth. And it was like life-changing for this parent who saw this happen, because teaching, like the parent didn't even know how to respond, didn't know how to help this child in that moment. So the simple things of helping them to try to be present, in the moment. A lot of grounding exercises with kids, like, feeling themselves in the chair, teaching them these kinds of strategies, and there are a million on them, and we have some resources, whether it's, apps or books, or there are all these little things that you can do, and you have to find what works for your kid, and some things might work in one situation, but not in another. So that is a really important piece of it, I think.
And then this goes back, I think this kind of hits on a theme we've been hitting on the whole time. It's just when you have those chances, when your child isn't stressed, when they're not avoiding, when they're not frustrated, not only teach, but make sure we're modeling them too, that we're showing them, if you've had a rough day at work and you come home and you go for a run, that you're sharing that with them. Or if you come home and say, it's not just, I need mommy time. It's no, I come home and I just take 10 minutes to myself, I go take a hot shower, I let my body calm down, and then I'm ready to cook dinner. And you're modeling that and sharing it with them, so that it's not always about them, but you're being part of that, that bigger picture, that environment that they live within, and that you're modeling those behaviors.
So I know we are running out of time, but we certainly have time for
We're made to the end.
a couple of questions.
So we have 5 minutes. We're going to bounce to a Q&A. Before we get into that, on that table over there, we kind of separated because at 3, Steve's going to come in and address another group, but we have brochures that are just sort of like the key takeaways. We have the white sheet is a list of resources, has apps, websites, books, etc. And then we have an example of some of the resources that we recommend to parents. So please feel free to peruse that table on your way out, grab any of the stuff, and we do have 5 minutes if anybody wants to ask questions or feedback or anything like that.
And we'll hang around if you're not comfortable asking it in a larger group.
I always have a question.
That's fine.
So with not incentivizing, what about kind of making a deal, right? So I have a kid who signed up for baseball camp at sleepaway, he's panicking because he doesn't want to go. And how I finally got the panic to subside was saying, okay, if you really hate it, I'll come and pick you up after the first day.
What happened?
The second day, he called me and said he wanted to come home that night. And then he said, I talked him into sticking out one more day. Then that next morning, he called and said, nope, I'm coming home by lunchtime. He texted me, I'm going to stay. It ended up being fine, which I thought it would. But I guess in providing that incentive that if you really hate it, I'll come pick you up. My thought was that he'll end up having a good time and want to stay. Is that?
Well, I think what you're saying there, without saying it, is that I think he actually has the skills to endure it. And so I just need to push him over that stress, right?
Yeah.
So if you think of stress as like realistic, like he knows he doesn't enjoy sleepaway camp. You know, kids, what happens when they get injured, and haven't used the bathroom, whatever. There's all kinds of issues that come up with that. But if you feel he or her has the skills to do it, and you just have to get him over that initial self-talk, I think that works. What I might do different in that situation would be like, what are you saying to yourself right now? Like almost have him talk it out loud so that you could see where those negative thoughts are coming from and almost challenge them. Right. Okay, so you're saying, you think you're going to go and you're going to be afraid to use the bathroom, you're going to poop all over yourself. Have you ever done that? You know what I mean? Like, you could, so whatever those fears might be, and just by having him talk it out, then he's taking what might be, I don't want to go to sleepaway camp, to I'm afraid of this little situation. You know what I mean?
And it's a social anxiety with him, so I don't know anybody that's gonna be there. I'm afraid I won't make any friends. I'm gonna be sitting by myself. Everyone else is gonna be having fun. He's, out of our three, by far the most social, and makes friends wherever he goes. So I had confidence in that, but I don't wanna make it worse, because we want next year then for it to be a little easier for him to go.
And then you can also compare it to other, like if you've ever heard him say that before, you can compare it to those situations, you know what I mean? It's like, so let's talk about, I feel like you've said that before. You know what, I remember you saying that when you joined the swim program at the Y, you know what I mean? And say, so what did you do there? Because if I remember you, I paid the bill, you stayed, so what did you do then? And again, going back to that self-reflection that kids don't naturally have. But incentivizing does, I remember because the notes Jen and I have, this was on kind of both lists, because it can work if it just gets them over that stress. So going back, there's a difference between stress and anxiety. Anxiety is like ongoing and irrational, where stress is like, it's just uncomfortable, and so pushing through a discomfort, knowing that once we get through it, it'll be okay, or we just have to get through it, can be a little different. So I know I kind of walked the side of the fence a little. Does that make sense?
I think material incentives may not be as healthy, but emotional incentives are. It's a little more healthy.
And I think the reassurance thing can be tricky with kids with anxiety too, right? Because again, if you're talking with a kid who's got regular stress, reassurance may do it. Reassurance may be like, oh, you'll be good, you know, I'll come and get you if I need to. That can be enough for some kids, but if it's kind of above and beyond that they just learn to look for the reassurance, and the reassurance is never enough.
We have to, I just got the end now, so I'll wrap by saying, never offer an incentive or reassurance that you can't follow through with. Because if you don't, then you're going to have a battle the next time. So only if you feel like it's right and meaningful and you can actually do it, will I even try.
Thank you guys.
Thank you very much, guys.